Okay, let's get ready for the AP US Government and Policy exam. So just a little bit of info about the upcoming exam. Just remember that it's Tuesday, May 12th, and it's the first exam. It's at 8 a.m. And the exam is broken up into two parts. And the first part is a 60-minute multiple choice section that you will have 45 minutes to use to answer all the questions. And here is a breakdown of the topics, and then for us, the chapters where different amounts of questions will come from. For example, 5 to 15% of the multiple choice questions come from topics regarding the Constitution. And so for us, that's chapters 1, 2, and 3. 5 to 15% of other questions come from public policy. And in our textbook, that's going to cover 16, 17, and 18. Civil liberties and civil rights are another 5 to 15% of the test, and this will be chapters 4 and 5 in our textbooks. Political beliefs and actions make up 10 to 20% of the questions, and that comes from chapters 6, 7, and 9. And interest groups and political parties make up another 10 to 20% of the total question amount, and those are chapters 8 and 10. And lastly, the biggest chunk of the questions are going to come from chapters 11 through 15 in our book, which cover the institutions of government. And as you can see, it's 30 to 45% of the total questions. And then the second part of the test actually is going to take the majority of your time because you will given 4 free response questions on which to write. So an adjustment that you will have to make during the test is you are not given 5 or 6 free response questions and you choose 4. You are given 4, and those are the 4 on which you have to write. And so just a little heads up on that. And so I just wanted to do some quick review. There's no way that we can cover all this information in a single PowerPoint, but I just wanted to go through some of the key topics to keep in mind. And the Constitution is, like I said, makes up a pretty small percent of the test, but it's on there regardless. So just keep in mind that the Founding Fathers, so the men who wrote the Constitution, were strongly influenced by Enlightenment thought and philosophy, and they read and studied the works of scholars like John Locke, Charles de Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Hobbes. And it was those Enlightenment figures who laid out a number of essential concepts in their work, including the ideas of civil liberties, inalienable rights, division of power within the government, and social contract between the people and the government. And then we see these ideas integrated into our own Constitution. And then the Articles of Confederation, we remember, is the predecessor to the U.S. Constitution. And the main weakness is that it created a very weak central government. And the articles were that a series of articles that were drafted beginning in 1776, and they had to be ratified by all 13 states, and this was done in 1781. And again, the fear of too much power or creating a power vacuum led to many of the weaknesses that made up the articles. And the newly created federal government could not do many things, including drafting soldiers, levying taxes, controlling debt, paying off debt, managing trade, and printing currency. And so these were fundamental weaknesses in this early document that were later corrected by the Constitution. The government also lacked an executive or judiciary branch at the time. And while the Articles of Confederation had a number of inadequacies during those early years, the young federal government won the Revolutionary War and negotiated the treaties ending the war. It also formally created a means to add states to the new union. So not a total failure, but it was a good rough draft of what our government would become. And ultimately it was Shays' Rebellion that was sort of the match that led to the implosion, calling for a new layout of the government. And if you remember Shays' Rebellion, a group of approximately 1,000 armed farmers attacked a federal arsenal in Massachusetts. The militia in Massachusetts was inadequate to manage the situation, and there was no essential backup of federal forces to bring security to the state. And so this called for a need for a much stronger central government. And so then we see the Constitutional Convention convene for 2 years, and some of the major issues that led to that 2-year period of discussion included things like representation, and how representation in the government would be determined. And if you remember, the Virginia plan offered proportional representation, leaving smaller states with a smaller stake and say in the federal government. And then the New Jersey plan suggested equal representation for each state regardless of the size. And finally, a third plan called the Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Compromise, endorsed a bicameral legislature. And the House of Representatives would offer the proportional representation based on the state's population per the Virginia plan. And then the Senate would offer equal representation to each state per the New Jersey plan. And then when it came to the issue of slavery, southern states with large slave populations wanted slaves to be included in their population count, while northern states did not. And so the final solution was the 3/5 compromise, where each state counted as 3/5 of one person when factoring population for representation in the House of Representatives. And clearly this is going to sort of draw the line in the sand between the North and the South, which is ultimately going to begin the early stages of the Civil War. And in terms of executive power, the Constitutional Convention did not just create a clear and structured bicameral legislature, but also a newly created executive and judicial branch, including the chief executive office of the president, whose responsibilities included signing bills, making them law, and vetoing bills. And then as a check on the executive power, the Constitutional Convention established that a presidential veto could be overruled by 2/3 vote of the legislature. So we see the theme of checks and balances coming into play. And the Supreme Court was also created during the Constitutional not conventionary, I just said that because that says judiciary right there, convention. And this was established as a means of arbitrating potential conflicts between states or between different branches of the government. And lastly, ratification and amendments of the Constitution come into play because there was still a great deal of disagreement over the Constitution and even what the role of the federal government was. And so during the months that followed the convention, several of the framers, including Madison and Hamilton, wrote and published essays supporting the Constitution. And together these are called the Federalist Papers. And the Federalists were opposed by the Anti-Federalists. Just remember that Federalists, including Madison, supported a strong federal government, and they advocated for the ratification of the Constitution as it was, and they opposed a Bill of Rights. And then Anti-Federalists feared a strong federal government and favored individual states' rights, and they strongly supported the creation of a Bill of Rights. And ultimately, the compromise is going to be to, I guess it's not really a compromise, the central government will have powers, but then there was a Bill of Rights added, and this the Constitution was ratified, including the Bill of Rights, the last 10, by 1791. So the amendments, know them. I don't know what else to say. Hopefully from your U.S. history classes and then our semester together, they are somewhat familiar. So remember, the First Amendment guarantees freedom of religion, speech, the press, and the right to assemble, and the freedom to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. Third Amendment prohibits the quartering of troops in private homes. And the Fourth Amendment provides protection in the courts, as well as from unreasonable search and seizure. The Fifth Amendment concerns court proceedings, due process of law, provides for a grand jury trial, preventing double jeopardy, and protecting individuals from self-incrimination. The Sixth Amendment also provides rights at a trial, including the right to a speedy trial and legal representation. The Seventh Amendment is outdated, providing for a trial by jury in cases of common law, and modern law is written or statutory based on statutes or laws. The Eighth Amendment prevents excessive bail and cruel and unusual punishment. The Ninth Amendment affirms both state and individual rights over things not named in the Constitution. For example, individual right to privacy is insinuated and protected by the Ninth Amendment. The 10th Amendment further defines states' rights, including the Commerce Clause, which gives the federal government the power to regulate trade between states. The 11th Amendment clarifies the rights of citizens to sue a state in which they do not reside, while the 12th Amendment focuses specifically on electoral law, and Amendments 11th and 12th were called the early amendments. The next series of amendments we have are the Civil War amendments, and if you remember, the 13th Amendment banned slavery, the 14th Amendment gives due process rights to all citizens, and the 15th Amendment granted voting rights to all men. However, full voting rights for many African Americans and for women did not exist until the 19th century. Nope, I just said 20th century. And between 1913 and 1920, 4 more amendments were added. The 16th created a system of federal taxation, while the 17th allowed the people to elect U.S. senators. The 18th banned the sale of alcohol and is also known as the Prohibition Amendment. The 19th Amendment in 1920 allowed women the right to vote. The 20th Amendment ensured a smooth succession and reduced the time between presidential elections and inaugurations. And the 21st Amendment was ratified by special state conventions, and that ended prohibition, so it repealed the 18th Amendment. The 22nd limits a president to 2 terms, and we can thank Franklin Delano Roosevelt for that. And the 23rd Amendment allows residents of Washington, D.C. to vote in presidential elections. The 24th ended poll taxes, opening up the polls to African Americans in the southern states. The 25th Amendment addressed presidential succession, including the selection of a new vice president. The 26th Amendment lowered the voting age from 21 to 18. And the 27th Amendment was ratified in 1992. Interestingly enough, 2 centuries after it was originally proposed, and this amendment requires that congressional pay increases take effect after the next election. The U.S. Constitution also created a federalist nation, which some rights reserved for the federal government and the remaining left to the states. Federal rights, sometimes called the enumerated, expressed, or delegated rights, include things like the right to regulate trade between states and internationally, the right to print currency valid in all states, the right to declare war on another nation, the right to make peace, treaty, and engage in diplomacy with other nations. States' rights are called reserved rights, and these include things such as the right to manage trade within the state itself, the right to issue licenses of all sorts of businesses or for individuals, and then we have some rights that are shared by both the federal and state governments. Those are known as concurrent rights, and these include things like levying taxes, building roads, maintaining a court system, and borrowing funds for the running of the government.
Not a worry in a world of cold beer in my hand. Life is good today. Life is good today. Adios and bye.